Hey everybody, welcome back to Fighting Matters. I'm Steve Kwan from BJJ Mental Models. I am here today with a first timer. I've got Michael Colborne on the line. How are you doing, Michael?
Not too bad. How are you doing?
I am doing it as well as can be.
Yes.
It's been it is a never-ending, insane news cycle, but you know what? There's a lot of topics to discuss here. Your particular area of expertise leads on to one of my favorites, but maybe I'll turn this over to you to introduce yourself first.
My name is Michael Colborne. I am a journalist and investigator at the website Bellingcat. We are a investigative journalism website. I focus on the transnational far right. I'm originally from Canada, but I'm based currently in the Netherlands. So,
got it. And of course, we've talked about aspects of the far right in the martial arts before. We've done several episodes on things like active clubs and neo-Nazi extremist groups in the sport. But I don't know for sure if everyone's listened to those episodes. So maybe for people who aren't familiar with the lingo, why don't you talk a bit about broad strokes, the kinds of organizations that you do research into and where they kind of fit into the political spectrum right now?
Well, most of the organizations or networks that I have investigated these days and a lot of the last few years, a lot of it is this so-called active club network. To try to keep the explanation relatively short, Active Club Network is a far right or even neo-Nazi network that was founded in, about late 2020 into 2021. It was founded by Robert Rundo, who was the founder of the Rise Above movement. He was arrested and after a long legal saga pleaded guilty to federal crimes and is free on probation right now. Essentially what Rundo did, and he's from the United States, from New York, but he was spending a lot of time in Europe when he, when he founded this whole active club movement. And he took a lot of inspiration from what he saw in Europe from existing far-right scenes who are much more actively into combat sports, especially those scenes around soccer hooliganism. I have to say soccer instead of football, I suppose. But I think when I say football hooligans, I think we know in context what kind we're talking about. But because Rundo spent a lot of time in Central and Eastern Europe, he became more familiar with some of the interrelationship between some of these violent far-right football hooligans and how they operated, and also this whole phenomenon that had already taken off, especially in Germany, of very well-organized like neo-Nazi fight, sort of like a neo-Nazi fight club scene with large-scale events that, for reasons we can go into, no longer go on. And he essentially founded the Active Club Network as sort of in some way a continuation of his original Rise Above movement, which he intended to be like, little more than, far-right street fighters who would assault anti-fascists and others and journalists at protests. And what the Active Club movement has become is this sort of network of almost cells across different countries, obviously many in the United States, but a lot in Europe and even actually a few in South America now, where this whole Active Club network is, I see it almost as like a brand or even a fashion that's kind of been placed on existing far-right scenes where they've got more into this trend of even fashion, far-right fashion, which is a thing in Europe that it really isn't yet in the United States, or really in the English-speaking space. But so Rundo just as an opportunist just sort of saw this, this opportunity, something new, and with his own, not with his organizational skills, he doesn't have those, but sort of by force of personality, tried to create this loose network of far right cells of young men and less young men who are obsessed with what I call fashion, fitness, and fighting. It's handy to just reduce it to 3 Fs, and that's really where the Active Club sort of movement came from. In other words, it came from an American seeing far right neo-Nazi scenes in Europe and just kind of thinking, wow, I could copy some of this. And he did.
I really like that way of distilling this down to the three F's. I've never thought of it that way, but you are completely right. From our conversations in this space, it really feels like a lot of this is attractive to young people because of the brand it represents. It's not just from what I can understand that people go into this because they think like, hey, well, you know what I really want to do is join a neo-Nazi fight club. It's more that there is something about the fashion and the fitness aspect of this that speak to the desired persona that a lot of disenfranchised young men want to adopt for themselves. As an older martial arts guy who got into jiu-jitsu in the 2000s, I remember the UFC's popularity was very much came up because of those three F's, right? There was that whole UFC style, affliction and
Oh, yeah.
tap out, the shirts that were everywhere in the 2000s. And so fighting for this century, at least, has always had kind of a distinct look and a distinct fashion. But it used to at least be associated more with things like the UFC or the fighting brand in general. It's interesting that you bring up that this is being specifically co-opted by these hate groups as well.
Yeah, and it's not just being co-opted; they're putting their own sort of spin on it, especially in terms of fashion. Now, speaking again of copying, there in this whole notion of far right fashion that exists in Europe in a way that it doesn't yet exist in the United States, where for years there have always been these big or less big far right fashion brands, and with those elements of the far right that are linked into football hooliganism, that's particularly the case in a lot of places across Central and Eastern Europe, where I've done a lot of my work, where there is actually, compared to, like you talked about, tap out in the 2000s and what, especially American or, across the, the English speaking space, what people would associate with like UFC or kind of fashion. It's a bit like that, but it really is, it's much more defined, this kind of aesthetic. It is, and it's an aesthetic that the active clubs in Rondo just like completely copied. I mean, anybody. I explained this to somebody from Poland once. Somebody who's been researching the far right, writing about the far right for decades, and I explained to them a bit about. Well, he was already familiar with the active club movement, of course, but I explained a little bit of the U.S. context and I guess the broader English-speaking context. And I explained to him, it's like, what they're doing is just taking what you, as a Polish person, a Polish researcher of the far right, would very easily recognize as just a typical, especially over the last decade or so, a typical football hooligan or football ultra aesthetic, and just copying it. So that is something that I think actually is newer for especially young American men, but I mean for youth in Europe who are very young and coming up, they're not already familiar with how some of these scenes work. So if anybody looks at active club videos or photos, the way they try to present themselves, the different kinds of black T-shirts and whatnot as a uniform, even the fashion brand that Rondo and active clubs try to run, it's copped right from they dress like football hooligans from Ukraine and Serbia and Bulgaria, because that's literally where it's coming from. So they really, in terms of appealing to young men, the aesthetic is really, and they're very obvious about this because they talk about it openly in their own podcasts. The need to really focus on aesthetics as a way to bring young men in, focusing on fashion, really being, disciplined in their own way in terms of their branding, like a consistency of branding and of messaging. It's deliberately structured that way, I think, to appeal to young men, with like any young person or less young person in this day and age, when so much of our anybody's, especially a young person's identity or experimentation or trying to find an identity is so focused on aesthetics and fashion. That's sort of the perfect way, or at least they think it's sort of a perfect way in for them without explicitly talking about politics when they first say, like, invite people for a little sparring session or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we are at a point right now where thankfully it is still not within the Overton window to just straight up literally endorse Nazism, but we're getting there real quick.
And it is not just in the U.S. So yeah, I mean, things are unfortunately, yeah, things are worse in the U.S. in that regard right now. But I would say it's much more global than that.
Yeah, yeah. And I bring this up because, as you mentioned, much of the time, my experience with these people is they won't literally come out and say what they stand for, but they will hide behind things they can deflect to, usually aspirational things that young men would appreciate, like the three Fs, right? Fashion, fitness, and fighting. And so often when we touch on this topic about active clubs, and I'm sure it will happen with this episode, we get a ton of
Oh, it
people in the
will.
comments. Yeah, yeah. We get a ton of people in the comments who pop in to defend active clubs, and usually their defense is something along the lines of, what's wrong with being a young man who cares about learning to defend himself? What's wrong with being a young man who wants to be the best version of himself and get in shape? And it's like, man, you are just completely deflecting. I got no issue with people wanting to get in shape or learn how to defend themselves. My issue is with the fact that that's marketing for what is effectively a hate group, right? We're not addressing this on the merits here. And I know that my concern and most people's concern is not that you want to get in shape or that you want to learn how to fight. It's that you are using the martial arts as a cover and as a front for a hate group. That is the real problem. But the fact that they present themselves as almost a lifestyle brand gives them
Yes,
plausible deniability that they can hide behind.
you mentioned lifestyle brand, and that is actually quite bang on. When with the most recent article that I wrote, it was what we did. Well, to explain the article a little bit, this active club movement in the United States, every year they try to host, one of sort of, well, I always just call it a fight night, a small fighting tournament, emphasis on small. And one of the most important things I think they do with these kinds of events, small scale, larger scale, one of the most important things to do with these kinds of events is to write about them, to investigate them, particularly when they are trying to, when they're trying to hide the location, when it's obvious that they've rented out a space and they don't want us, or really especially me, to figure out where the location is. This time around, I got a tip from researchers from the SoCal Research Club who, investigate neo-Nazis and especially active clubs in Southern California. One of their contacts reached out to me. It was pretty simple. It was, hey, I'm pretty sure we geolocated where this late in, over the Labor Day weekend. I'm pretty sure we geolocated it. We knew it was in San Diego. Okay, it was no secret. It was in the San Diego area, but I've never been there, but I know it's not small. So a lot of possible places to rent. But with some of the photos that some of these active clubs and their sort of media propaganda put out on Telegram, they were very kind to us and left enough details in the background, especially some bright orange walls and some features. And, it didn't take long for SoCal Research Club and then myself double checking it. Literally took me 5 minutes to double check it with where they suspected, 99% likelihood where they thought it was. It was like, yeah, this is it. And the reason why it's good to sort of expose where these events take place is because of the tactics they use to try to rent out these spaces. When I was speaking for this article, communicating with this article for the individual who was, responsible for renting out this venue on weekends in the San Diego area, it's actually a professional wrestling venue, so it's got a boxing / professional wrestling ring. And they've, I've had a few email exchanges with this individual, and they told him that they were filming an activewear brand commercial. That's what they were using the venue for. That they were going to have like 75 people there, that they were going to have women and children in the crowd. Yeah, they literally said they were shooting like a lifestyle activewear brand commercial, but no, they did a small fighting tournament with fighters, people, not just you know, random kids who, are interested in getting beat up in a ring or beating up other people in a ring. But these are people, especially people who were active in organizing it and who have been active in organizing these events in the last few years. These are violent neo-Nazis, many of them who have criminal records, many of whom have been involved in a lot of violence and a lot of violent criminal activity. These are not just aw shucks kind of nice guys who are really that interested in just getting fit and learning a bit of self-defense like a quote unquote normal person. It's very clear that the intention behind all this combat sports training, the pageantry and the hypermasculinity of these little tournaments and all the video and the photo that they try to put out for it. It's, well, one, of course, it's propaganda to, try to bolster their own ranks, but it's just actively training up for political violence. I've been saying that for years about these people, and it's increasingly clear that's what it is. Anytime that somebody wants to try to deflect with a comment, like the comments you said, I mean, I've heard a million times or seen a million times. I mean, I just ignore them. Where it's like, oh, what's wrong with going to the gym? Like, that's not the point. Like, oh, we're just learning, we're just learning self-defense. We're just practicing boxing. It's like, that's not the point. It's very clear what you're trying to do. And this kind of doublespeak, I mean, the far right always likes to engage in this kind of doublespeak where they present a more sanitized front stage for the public, but then the backstage is where some of the less subtle action happens. They're, they try to play that game, and I don't think it works particularly well.
Mm-hmm. Maybe not with us, although something they're doing is drawing the attention of young men who seem especially vulnerable to this. And I would love to maybe dig into how this happens. What is the pipeline for how a 15-year-old boy gets recruited and ultimately turned into an extremist through these pipelines? I mean, the fashion is part of it, but what are we looking for when we talk about the fashion aesthetic of the far right? I mean, you mentioned the part of the problem I find is that actually for a layperson, keeping track of all of the weird coded symbols they have, it's not always obvious. I mean, you mentioned black shirts. That's the first time I've heard of that. Shit, I'm wearing a black shirt right now. Now I'm thinking, do I have to take...
Yeah.
Do I have to take this thing off?
I'm wearing a brand that they probably wear too, and I have other brands in the closet that they wear too. Not some of them, but the mainstream ones.
So what does that aesthetic look like? I mean, I just recently, the more I dig into this, I learn about these weird coded messages that these far right groups have. Like, they got secret numbers like the 1488 thing, and there's the red shoelaces thing, and all sorts of weird Nordic runes. What does that kind of aesthetic look like, just so that people understand the style that we're talking about here?
With the active clubs and other sorts of similar movements, both in the United States and other places, particularly Europe, and depending on the country, like the national dynamic, depending on the political situation, even depending on the law, they will play games with certain symbols. They know that, with the exception of a few obvious symbols like a swastika, the vast majority of people, even well-intentioned, intelligent people, are not going to know all of these little codes unless they're a nerd like me, which maybe that's a better thing. Like, for example, the active club movement, every active club has in their different, emblem, they have the Celtic cross in it, quote unquote Celtic cross. There's nothing Celtic about it, but that's a long-standing sort of white supremacist neo-Nazi symbol that started to be used mostly in Europe after the Second World War. And once somebody like in your position or mine just starts to look into neo-Nazi and far-right movements, that's a symbol you see all the time. But it's not something that is going to stand out to a lot of people. When they use explicitly neo-Nazi imagery, which some of the active clubs do, like, for example, some of them will have that, active clubs particularly, they're generally, especially with the propaganda they put out, you're never going to see a swastika. You're never going to see anything that your average person knows from history as being associated with the Nazis. They'll do slightly more clever things, like include a reference to a specific Waffen SS division patch in their logo. They will, they will wear clothes from far-right fashion brands, less so in the United States because those brands don't make it over from Europe, with the exception of like kind of the quote-unquote official active club brand. They, a lot of times these clothes, like with the slogans on them, they might look relatively innocuous. They might just look to an average person almost like kind of faux tough guyish. They might not look, unless you really look for the clues, or sometimes those even aren't necessarily on there. You're only going to recognize, somebody's only going to recognize some of these symbols or these brands unless they know to look for these symbols. And I think it's really important. It's something that underpins a lot of the work that I'm doing, and actually a lot of the work that I'm doing, over the next while, is trying in my own way to improve what I would call the sort of visual literacy around the far right, like not to discount other far rights. There's unfortunately a lot of far rights in the plural we could be talking about these days, but sort of these more violent far right and neo-Nazi scenes where their symbols that they use, their number codes, like you mentioned, the 1488, and there's other ones I don't need to get into now, although I could. Part of what I really want to try to do, and I think is really important transnationally, is, like I said, really doing my part, our part, to try and generate a bit more visual literacy, especially among journalists and researchers and watchdogs of the far right and political violence, to understand more about the groups that they're seeing online or even in person at protests. Like, I'll give an example. There was at one of the Charlie Kirk, it was a Charlie Kirk related vigil. It was held in Huntington Beach at the beginning of September. I mentioned in my most recent Bellingcat article, it was a right wing vigil for Charlie Kirk, and different active clubs as well as Patriot Front showed up. They had their active club flags. They had the Patriot Front guys with, what I think are their silly uniforms and their masks, and a few other people. Now, to me and to I think a lot of other people, maybe not that many people, it's so transparently obvious who these people are. But in media reporting, I looked at some more local media reporting about that rally, and nobody mentioned the fact that, hey, there were these neo-Nazis there who were getting into arguments with pro-Charlie Kirk conservatives and right-wingers. If looking at some of the articles about that, the irony of this was a little too much for me when I read it, that some of these pro-Kirk, vigil goers and, presumably, right-wingers, conservatives, of whatever stripe, they were accusing the active club guys and neo-Nazi guys of being Antifa, of being just trying to make the protest look bad. And then, of course, at the end of the night, a lot of these active club guys, they assaulted somebody on video from multiple angles. And I was easily able to identify somebody who took part in it. And other people I know were as well. I don't think anything's happened to those people. So it's really, like I said, it's really difficult because a lot of the symbols and imagery that the far right uses, especially online, it it can change really quickly. A lot of the times it can be, it's wrapped in so many levels of irony and tongue-in-cheekedness that it, and that itself serves a purpose. So they can say, "Oh, we're just trolling." It's like, well, you are trolling, but you're also being serious at the same time with it. Like if you remember if listeners remember, it's still being used, like the OK hand signal that was originally kind of used by the far right as like a joke years ago, but it's now become a completely earnest and serious far right hand symbol to use, where like with the Christchurch terrorist, flashed it in his trial. And I've seen it from other right wingers, even across Europe, like understanding not just the symbols, but how they're employed, and also how they co-opt more mainstream symbols, even in not so much in the American context, but how I've seen it in other country contexts where different right-wing groups have kind of co-opted older national flags. So give a quick example. I'm based here in the Netherlands, and 2 weekends ago there was a far-right riot in the capital, The Hague. The Hague's technically the capital, the political capital, not Amsterdam. I don't need to get into the semantics of what the capital of the Netherlands is, but it was in The Hague, and I won't go into the details of it, but one thing a flag that the far right here has started to use a lot more is an older Dutch flag called, if any Dutch listeners are going to be so offended by my pronunciation, the Prinsenvlag, the prince's flag. And it's a flag it's an older flag that has a shade of orange on the top, white and blue. God, I hope I got those right. I think I did. And it's like, it's an older Dutch symbol, and it actually is part of flags in the US. Like, I think it's actually, if you look at the colors of the New York State flag, it's probably there. So it's like an old symbol, but it's become co-opted by the far right here to such a point that one of the main retailers here in the Netherlands, Bol, which is kind of like it's kind of like a local Dutch and Belgian Amazon, they've actually stopped selling that flag in the past few weeks because of how much that flag has been co-opted and associated with the far right, even though when you look beyond that, it's just an older flag and a color, a shade of orange that's very common politically in this country because of its history. But they're still co-opting what was kind of a normally received flag. But now when I talk to Dutch people about this who I know, and a lot of them see, like, as soon as they see a sticker of that flag or see that flag, they already know something about their politics. So that's kind of a coy use of what's a, quote unquote normal symbol, but using it in a very different meaning and context, that especially when, say, there's a riot in the Capitol where they smash up some Liberal Party windows, their office, and assault like 7 to 9 journalists and fight cops and all sorts of fun or less fun stuff than that.
So I want to talk a little bit about the damage that these active clubs can do, because again, when I get pushback from their members in our comments, it is usually something
You'll get
along
more.
the lines
Don't worry.
I'm ready for them.
Once they see my name and my face here, hey boys, they'll be happy.
But I would love to know, when they come in and defend themselves and say what's wrong with fitness, what's wrong with fighting. I mean, again, these very disingenuous responses, they're deflecting from the root of what they're trying to do. What is the actual harm that these organizations do? Because some people might hear this and they might think, well, these people have terrible beliefs, but they can't be doing that much harm. But you've brought up that what these groups do very often is they escalate to physical violence.
Yeah.
And how can we shed some light on the kinds of problems that these people cause beyond just being online agitators?
Yeah, they're more than online agitators. These are not just guys online. The people who are behind most of these active clubs, or a lot of these active clubs, I don't have the list in my head right now, but I'm thinking of, like, there's Mr. Rundo, who's got a long criminal history, a long legal saga, which he mostly blames me for, as far as I'm aware. Like there's active clubs who their senior members are people who have served time in prison for racist assaults or even manslaughter or murder. Uh, and they're, people who have been arrested, leaders who have been arrested. I don't know if ever convicted, but at least arrested on even child endangerment charges. I'm just speaking of the U.S. here. The leader of the Southern California Active Club was one of the individuals involved in the assault after this Charlie Kirk vigil that I mentioned. For this article, I was re-looking up his criminal background, and like this is just a long laundry list of things he's been arrested or convicted and even pleaded guilty for. And then that's not just talking about violence and more in the past tense. In the same thing happens in Europe with these active clubs. I know in Sweden, at least a few weeks ago, it might have been in August, there were, I think, four young men arrested. I think one or two of them might have been under 18. They were affiliated with a sort of active club network or active club scene in Sweden, and they were arrested for racist assaults in Stockholm, like just going after, non-white people and, you know, verbally and physically assaulting them. Here in the Netherlands, an individual who's led a far-right group who has been associated with the active club movement at times, but also the identitarian movement. He was arrested in August on suspicion of preparing a terrorist act and illegal weapons possession. In the German context, there's people who have been associated with active clubs, long criminal histories, past and present. France, I mean, I'm just thinking of some of the ones off the top of my head. And like the people who are really, you kind of take charge of these networks or these clubs, even on a local level. I mean, these are not wannabe horn-rimmed glasses-wearing wannabe intellectuals on the far right who are, talking about the French Nouvelle Droite or something. These are guys who are steeped in some history of violence, whether they've been part of neo-Nazi scenes before and or related football hooligan scenes. They've been around this kind of violence and they perpetuate it. And then of course the danger becomes when there are younger men, teenagers who can get like very targeted, recruited into these movements. That's how they get them in. They get them in. Maybe they get them in because these kids may have already started to be curious about neo-Nazi movements and they snap them up that way. Other times it's more deliberate with the way that they even set up like their initial training sessions. And Mr. Rundo has been very helpful, but by talking about this stuff so openly over the years, where he's talked about like when you're an active club and you're starting one up and you want to have, first timers show up to your training sessions, like, yeah, don't talk about politics. I think he literally says something like, yeah, don't start talking about the Jews. Keep it focused on like this hyper masculine overemphasis on brotherhood and community and becoming stronger and powerful and blah 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 blah. Getting them in that way, and then whether they're committed enough or not, and it just has to be a small group of people. And to be clear, with some of these active clubs, these are not, there are many of them around the globe, but these little active clubs on local levels, like they are not big. These guys are not particularly skilled at mass recruiting. They are really more trying to, where they can, pick off and recruit from places where they can, and depending on literally just like their skill level or their intelligence or lack thereof, sometimes they can pull in a few more, and other times they can barely pull in any, but it doesn't make them any less of a threat.
Yeah. Whenever I get exposed to people in the real world who I discover are far right, often I'll notice that they will test the boundaries of what's acceptable within the conversation by throwing out some very common right-wing agitator points just to kind of test the other person's receptivity to the idea. So, for example, in the martial arts, I will often hear people and they'll throw out some comment about like, oh, can you believe these trans athletes, right? And they're trying to gauge what the other person is going to say, right? Because if the other person says, what the fuck are you talking about? Shut up. Then they know it's not there. But if the person comes back and says, oh yeah, I'm not a fan of that, we can't have them, then they know that, okay, we can keep advancing the conversation a little bit to the right. And eventually it gets to the point where we're just openly hating on these groups and maybe even going beyond that.
That's exactly the same kind of logic. Just another anecdote I was going to mention. Another individual in Europe who's kind of been associated with the active club movement, or at least the sort of neo-Nazi fighting scene, is a French national also of Polish background. He lived, past tense, lived for several years in Bulgaria. It's a country I've actually reported a fair bit from over the years. And he was living in Bulgaria. And one of the things that he was trying to do, I've talked to people on the ground, one of the things that he was quite active in doing was trying to do as much recruiting into, maybe not explicitly an active club, but recruitment into the neo-Nazi scene at combat sports gyms in Sofia, in the capital of Bulgaria. And what's unfortunately helpful in that city is, or in that country, period, like other countries in the region, is a well-developed football hooligan scene who is already into combat sports. Many of them are, very explicitly far-right. So there are, more friendly gyms, but then there are more quote-unquote normal or mainstream gyms. This guy was, among other activities he was up to in Bulgaria, he was trying to do a lot of recruiting that way. And he ended up getting banned and kicked out of the country, I think last year, it's in 2024. Yeah. So when they're really, really hardcore, violent leadership figures, they're really spending 24/7 trying to recruit as many, susceptible young men as they can, even if it's not a large number, with some of the political violence that, we've seen in some places in the world, and that unfortunately I think we're more than just starting to see in the US. Just a small group of people who are willing and able to exercise violence against their perceived political enemies, that can have a tremendous impact. So if people want to kind of play devil's advocate and say, oh, well, these active clubs are not a mass movement. They're not out recruiting hundreds of kids at every single combat sports gym. Well, they're not. But what they're trying to recruit and train up for is to have small groups of young men, cells, almost, who are, like I said, able and willing to go that extra few miles when things get even more politically dicey.
Mm-hmm. What would you suggest? And I'm just thinking as a parent here, right, and as an older guy in the martial arts, this podcast is hosted by a bunch of 40 and 50-year-old dudes, so we are not exactly the prime demographic for the fight sports.
Yeah, but yeah, I share. I'm the same demographic. Yeah.
But I am the parent of a young child, right? And so I am tremendously concerned about exposure to these symbols. As a parent who may not be up to speed on what these groups are doing, what are some of the warning signs that you should look out for? I mean, if you've got a teenage boy at home, obviously there's going to be maybe some stuff that's a little bit obvious, like if he puts up a swastika flag, but it's like you said, it's not always that clear. What kind of signs and symbols should concern a parent that maybe their child is getting drawn into these groups?
I think there's a number of ways to answer that question, or to speak to it as best as I can. One thing is if someone's child, teenager, this is becoming more of the case, I think, slowly in the US, but it's nothing like Europe, and even here it's a bit smaller. But where with, say, even the martial arts gear that they might have, there are far right brands of combat sports gear who there are, because they sell them, their own branded boxing gloves. It may not look that obvious, but you can recognize the brand and maybe some subtle fascist and far right imagery on it. Uh, looking to see like what if there's sometimes if there's weird little brands, including t-shirts that you yeah that in terms of symbolism, if you don't even have to recognize a symbol, but if it looks like something with a symbol might be a bit off, then do as best you can and look it up. Maybe there's something a bit ambiguous about it, and maybe it's not an issue, but maybe somebody looks it up and realizes, oh, these are two T-shirts from or something from one of these active clubs. Then that could be, I think, a real sign of concern. I think beyond that, it's just. I say this as somebody who was not a parent, so it's a bit it's a bit harder for me to offer that perspective. But again, I would just speak to that. It's if a parent is even potentially worried about their child, even not even necessarily falling into, but maybe being exposed to these types of wannabe far right and neo-Nazi recruiters at their gym, develop slowly developing some of that visual literacy, like going to the gym and seeing who these, kind of strange, almost criminal looking guys might be. Like, oh, what shirts are they wearing? What tattoos do they have? Oh, that's what those symbols are. Oh, shit. Of course, they could just be, tough looking dudes with tattoos. That does happen. But I really think the key, especially with some of these more newer far right and neo-Nazi movements, not just active clubs, is really much more strongly developing a sense of visual literacy, like I said, in terms of understanding more about the aesthetics that they use and why, and understanding that there is going to be some sort of ambiguity behind not all, but a lot of the brands, the symbols that they might use, where, like I said, unless you're a nerd like me, odds are you're not going to immediately recognize the sort of symbolism. But with a bit of a simple bit of online research, because of course these guys are all extremely online, it's not really that hard to kind of identify what some of these brands might be, or what some of these symbols tattooed on their bodies might or might not mean.
Yeah, yeah. I've got some thoughts on this. It's something I've been thinking about a bit. We did an episode on active clubs a while back with Mac Lamoureux, and he was talking about how
Another Canadian,
yeah,
by the way.
that's right. That's right. And he was talking about the sun and rad as a symbol that is often used and appropriated by hate groups. And I was just thinking, like, I've never heard this word in my life. If you asked me to Google, I had to try to figure out, like, okay, how do I spell this? What is a sun and rad? And then I looked it up and I saw the symbol and I thought, oh, I've seen that symbol. But I never would have known just by the word that this is such a thing, right? I mean, we all know what a swastika is called. You can Google it and you can find it.
And we all know it because it's part of our cultural, anybody in the, not just the West, but we all know what that symbol means. We all know what that represents. It's less so
most parents may not know what a Celtic cross is or what that represents. They might just think it's a stylistic thing.
Yeah, they're seeing Celtic cross like, oh, that's just a thing from Irish gravestones, which it partly is, but that's not even entirely the point. It's incredibly hard to recognize a lot of the symbols that the far right uses. Like you talked a bit earlier about some of the, pagan or Nordic symbols that the far right uses. They will use some, sort of pagan or Nordic imagery that is actually used in a non-hateful setting by, practitioners of paganism or people who are into that sort of thing. Like even a Thor's hammer, like that sort of pendant or symbol. I mean, I've seen that tattooed on far right dudes, but I've also
I've
seen
seen
it.
that tattooed on Marvel fans.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point. Yeah, you can't draw a conclusion, or shouldn't be able to draw a conclusion just from one pagan or Nordic symbol because of its other uses. But when somebody is using, you know, sorts of, runes that the Nazis and other sort of Nazi collaborators and current neo-Nazis use, then it gets a bit harder. Like one of the runes that's used by, neo-Nazis is called the Tyr rune. If I'm pronouncing it properly, I'm probably not. But what makes that ambiguous is that it really is just an upward arrow. Like that has to be evaluated in context. Like as a parent, no, you shouldn't freak out if you see somebody who's got something with an arrow on it. But usually when one of these kinds of symbols is involved in a far right context, there are going to be other ones. So somebody is not just going to have one tattoo that looks a bit, oh, that kind of looks like, this or that. And then there's nothing else, you know, that that could mean something to maybe worry a bit less about. But if somebody's got one far right or neo-Nazi tattoo, they've usually got more. If they've got one far right or neo-Nazi T-shirt from a brand, even with very subtle symbols, they've got more. They don't just have one neo-Nazi shirt in the closet; they've got several.
I mean, I do have some thoughts about how to help people identify these symbols. Like you said, the big challenge with active clubs is because they are decentralized and always evolving and terminally online, their chosen symbols and the way that they present themselves can evolve and change and be hard to pin down specifically. But there are a few things that you can do. One of them, of course, is if you know the names of the people that you're training with, look them up, because man, some people, a lot of these people do not have very well concealed records.
They do not, especially in the United States. Let me tell you that, even I've, sorry to interrupt, with some of the research I do, I come across a name and I quickly look it up. It's like, oh, geez. Oh, okay. That was easy to find this criminal record. It's not that easy in every European country. Let me tell you.
Yeah. So it's always worth just doing a quick internet search for the names of the people involved, because sometimes you will immediately discover there's a problem. Beyond that, the challenge with a lot of symbols is they're hard to search for if you don't know what they're called. Like, again, if you don't know that the Sun and Rad is called the Sun and Rad, you can't just Google that.
And has other names as well. Exactly. Yeah. Where there's sometimes different names that are used for the same symbols.
Yeah. But there are things that you can do as the layperson, right? I mean, if you're a parent and your kid's bringing home weird, like Nordic looking stuff and you don't quite know the context of it, and you're not some terminally online groiper, so you don't know what these all mean. I mean, we've got one of the things that we can do now, take photos of that shit, put it into Chat GPT and say, what is this symbol and who uses it?
Exactly.
And if it comes back and it says that like this symbol is used by neo-Nazis, well, you should be a little bit concerned then. If it comes back and says this is just some goofy thing, then that's different. So, I mean, use those tools, because AI image recognition is a super powerful thing for figuring out like what these coded symbols mean.
Exactly. And one of the things we're trying to do, and something that I'm leading over the next few months, is actually to try to develop a short, small visual glossary of some of the most common far-right or neo-Nazi symbols that are used transnationally. Not so much, symbols of a specific group or movement, because that can be another encyclopedia in and of itself, but trying to focus on a few dozen of the more common symbols that you might see in a transnational context, also with a few less common ones that might be tied to some very specific context, but they still get used transnationally. That's something that we'll be working on over the next few months, and hopefully that's going to be a resource that, like you're alluding to, something that can be quite useful, well, for anybody down the road.
Yeah, just because that sounds tremendously useful, and it's something I have been looking for myself.
So have I. So I decided to make one.
Do you have an inkling as to where you're going to publish it, just so that if people listen to this episode 6 months from now?
A few months from now, well, speaking in October 2025, within early 2026, it should be online. So maybe let's just say January to February 2026. I can't believe it's already coming 2026, but yeah.
I know, time flies, man.
Yeah.
Well, I'd love to have you back on at that point, because to do a conversation just running through those symbols as an info packet, the big thing that I have found in the martial arts is a lot of the people in the sport and just maybe just in general, but especially within the martial arts, they're very ignorant about politics and the consequences of this stuff. They will often, you'll see guys in the UFC now and in the jiu-jitsu community who are openly espousing just clearly unambiguous Nazi shit. And people will say, oh, it's just, free speech, whatever. And they don't,
It's just trolling. It's just joking,
yeah, and they don't see the harm of this stuff. So I think having more info for awareness purposes would be very helpful. Oh, I really feel like for a lot of these people who get sucked into this stuff, there's a lot of awareness issues and there's a lot of ignorance. And I think that's where their participation here comes from. I mean, I've talked to some people that I identify kind of as far right, and if I can if I can pierce the info barrier, because pretty much anything that I present, they will immediately push back and say fake news, can't trust that source because they're woke. But if I can connect with them and actually present them with real info, quite often I find they're quite ignorant, and much of their support of far right groups comes from not understanding what those groups actually do and why they're wrong.
Yeah, these active clubs and other kinds of organizations, whether in the U.S. or other places, like these are not free speech advocates. I mean, come on. I mean, there's a reason why we made a short Instagram video last year, a kind of an active club explainer. It's probably about a year and a half old now, but on Bellingcat's Instagram, if people are curious, and at least in a few parts in that video, I go through a few examples of some of the violent activities that these individuals have been involved in, and a year and a half later there's even more. Like, this is not just speech, this is not just being edgy online, and it certainly is not just trying to look cool and lift weights as if nobody else does that. It's preparing and practicing political violence. That's the point of it all. And that's the point they always try to hide. But guys, you're very, very bad at it. So, yeah.
A challenge that I find when addressing these groups is that one thing that they are doing, and that actually in general the far right is much better at doing than progressives, is they're very good at building direct community one-on-one with the kind of people they want to recruit, right? I mean, you and I can put as much content as we want on the internet about this stuff, but at the end of the day, we will never be able to persuade someone through this vehicle as effectively as if I could get them into a martial arts gym and train with them one-on-one directly. And you see this with a lot of far-right outreach groups, right? They're very good at infiltrating into churches and other community groups where, I mean, God, you can, listening to the Pod Save America bros is one thing, but if your pastor starts telling you what to believe politically, it's going to be much more persuasive, even if that person doesn't have a clue what they're talking about, or if they're just straight up lying or they're being unpersuasive. The act of indoctrinating people from a position of power and leadership is very strong. And that's what these martial arts groups do, right? They'll bring in these kids, and the role, your martial arts coach, especially when it's a young person, they have a lot of psychological influence over that person.
And they know it.
So, yeah. So, I mean, what would you say people can do to push back on that, knowing that on the ground community is so powerful, and we probably aren't doing enough of that? What do you think could be done to kind of counter program these active clubs?
I think it's literally just being more, no pun intended, being more active on the ground, trying to counter that kind of activity that that these kinds of folks do on the ground, trying to counter the way that they will deliberately try to infiltrate, co-opt, deliberately recruit. It's important to be, yourselves active. Again, no pun intended, in these gyms, in these spaces, and not just active, but aware, like we were talking about a bit earlier, being aware of not just the aesthetics or visuals, but understanding the sorts of recruitment tactics that some of these kinds of individuals will try to use. Something that, unfortunately, I think the far right, understands more intimately than whatever we call the rest, the left, quote unquote, progressives, what have you, is that I think the far right now, and more recently, but especially now, has a much more acute grasp of the power of culture that I think the rest of us have forgotten. And they understand the power of, I mean, we can do all the podcasts and videos and whatnot that we want, and that's not a bad thing. But I think the far right understands that just completely flooding the information space with their content and propaganda is something that can slowly shift political conversations in their favor. They understand the power of culture, popular culture, and subcultures, like something like different subcultures, of course, that could be involved in different kinds of combat sports and scenes. They understand the power of subcultures in forming identity and forming like a young person's identity, and then forming a political identity. And I think it's important for people who are the vast swath of people who are not far right to also understand that a bit more ourselves, that don't cede the broader cultural ground to the far right just because the non-far right progressives, the left, liberals, what have you, whatever word we want to use, don't cede all this cultural ground to them just because we have not recognized its power over the last several years or decades. It's something you see when you sort of but when you see the way these active clubs propagandize online, especially on Telegram. Like if you follow a bunch of these different channels and other related channels, and it's not just that you're bombarded with propaganda and imagery and hate speech and more videos and this disinformation or this BS or that. You get sucked into this world that is just created for you, this alternate reality where you literally believe people like you and I are out to kill them. These are the kinds of things that at least they pretend to believe, I think the far right understands this, especially in the internet age. The rest of us do not as much.
Yeah, I think you might be right. I mean, as of this recording, just a few days ago, Pete Hegseth got up in front of his generals and told them, no more fat soldiers, no more fat generals. I mean, much of that conversation was very much an appeal to aesthetics. Right. What he was basically saying is we don't care about competence anymore. We care about a certain look and a certain vibe. And that is something that is very powerful and persuasive to young men who value the appearance of strength, right? They might not know what strength really is.
Yeah.
So when you're 15, 16, 20 years old, the appearance of strength can be a substitute. And what I have noticed with talking to a lot of these people is that becomes a basis for their decision making. So when COVID happened, that was a huge point of contention in the martial arts community, which has a massive, anti-vax, anti-science movement within it. And a lot of the far right people that I know were saying things like, well, why should I take medical advice from all of these people who can't even get their own bodies in shape? And so the implication was, well, we can't listen to Anthony Fauci because he's not jacked.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
There's all of these influencers with abs telling me that COVID is a hoax, and look at how healthy they are.
Look how jacked and cool these people look. I mean, they got why wouldn't I believe them? As sort of
exactly. Yeah. So people will buy into the aesthetic, and it's really easy for people who are not versed in critical thinking to start deprioritizing competence and start looking instead for appearance, right? The appearance of competence. I'm actually quite surprised with all of these ICE raids that are happening in the States that they are allowing so many of these clearly fat, out of shape people in homemade outfits to do this job. I figure we're probably only a few months away from stormtrooper type outfits that all of these guys get, so they have an aesthetic.
Their aesthetic even like I'm sure, yeah, they're from their point of view, I think they would understand for their cynical goals that the aesthetic needs to be cleaned up a little bit. I think especially in the internet and social media age, especially with younger people, but certainly not just with younger people. It really is aesthetics above all. Just to use more alliteration or whatever, really. And again, that ties back to active clubs where a lot of the message that comes through in these photos and videos, well, first of all, unless you're into that and maybe susceptible to it, I mean, it looks like parody. I mean, it's just constant, like, dudes with their shirts off and some dudes allegedly on steroids. Some of them, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious, but like this constant, like, even when the messaging, like the words, is so stupid sometimes that I sometimes look at it and I see, wouldn't other people on the far right make fun of you for saying this? I think maybe they do. But when the point is just completely hammering, like, oh, the most important thing is to be jacked. Of course, spoiler, they're not all jacked. They're
Donald Trump, notoriously jacked,
yeah, notorious.
jacked guy,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And that's like even Rundo and some of the very open advice that he gave for starting up an active club. He was even like, yeah, don't put your out of shape guys up front in your photos. Put the guys with the best aesthetics, put them in the video. If somebody's not, of the right appearance to be in the video, tell them, no, like, you can't be you don't look good enough to be in the content yet. And I think really cynical people like that, cynical kind of manipulative people like that, understand with the kinds of people that they're targeting that it really is aesthetics above everything else. It's like, oh, as long as I look cool, even if I'm completely doctoring the hell out of the photo, that matters more than whatever ungrammatical thing I'm saying in the video or whatever I've written underneath it. It's just like, oh, if I look cool, that's all that matters.
And we see this a lot in the jiu-jitsu community where, so much of the social media game is glamour shots and trying to post hustle stuff. And it's
Yeah.
just, it's very distasteful in a lot of ways, but clearly you get hit by enough of that and it is persuasive to some extent, right? I mean,
Yeah.
aesthetics are something that people care about. And especially if those aesthetics are tied to a sense of belonging and community, you can see how these symbols become powerful.
Yeah, that is the key thing where the aesthetics factors into it. The aesthetics is sort of a gateway into feeling a sense of belonging, which I think we all crave, but especially a young person craves. And yeah, aesthetics as a gateway into the sort of belonging, and then becoming perceived as being part of a broader community that gives them meaning and identity. I think that's what it boils down to.
Well, Michael, as we, tie this one up, any closing thoughts or calls to action that you want to share, which you think are important for the audience to know?
I'll say two things. One, I think the first thing I'll say is kind of tying into what I've said previously. I think it's really important to all of us, wherever we live, the different roles that we might play, journalists, concerned citizens, researchers, investigators, whatever. It's really critical for all of us to start developing or trying to develop much greater sense of visual literacy, understanding the kinds of visual language and aesthetics that different kinds of hate groups and individuals and movements use. It's difficult, like I said, because some of it can be very couched in context. It can be very, very subcultural. You don't need to know everything, but I think it's important for people who are in a position who might be sort of like opinion formers, um, I think it's important for them to take even a small scale leadership role and understand what some of those, they'll sort of be the leaders in terms of visual literacy in that sense. And I think the second tongue-in-cheek point that I make is just for any of the fans listening, just please keep posting. Just don't stop posting. And because these groups, these kinds of groups, now, not everybody on the far right is addicted to posting. I would say the vast majority of them are. But a lot of the kinds of the most concerning individuals and groups and movements, they need social media. They need to propagandize. So for anybody who, you come across even a small, somebody's account on Instagram is becoming actually a much more serious place for the far right, even if it's sometimes very coded. But important to recognize that a lot of these kinds of people, they're going to be posting on social media. If you want to find out what they're doing, what they're about, just go look, because they're going to post about it. And even when they try to post things, like I talked about the article that I just wrote, even when they try to post things and hide it, you can't hide everything, guys. The fact that, like, no matter what you do, no matter how much blurring these guys do, no matter how much black and white filtering they put on, no matter what tight angles they put on, thinking they're hiding everything from me or from other people, it's all still there. The only way to avoid the only way for these far right guys to avoid exposing themselves on social media is to give up social media, and that's not going to happen. So keep it up.
And it also helps that most of those far right people, from my experience, are dumb as bricks. So
I'm not going to disagree with that. So
yeah. Well, I think that's good to say, man. I mean, I've been thinking recently about how can we encourage action, because I don't want to just be screaming into the void on these episodes here. How can we encourage people listening to this to do something meaningful? Sometimes it feels like posting on social media is useless, or it's virtue signaling, or a waste of time. And look, it is true.
It can. It can be. Yeah.
It is true that in-person grassroots action is probably the most meaningful thing that a lot of us can do. But posting on social media does matter, because right now, yeah, especially in our space, the martial arts space, the Overton window has been completely occupied by far-right influencers. Even if you are a nobody in the jiu-jitsu community or the MMA community, publicly pushing back against the far right immediately makes you special, because there are not many people who are doing it. And if you do it, and that gives 3 of your friends the courage to do the same, that's how you start a movement.
Exactly. And maybe a last, again, partly tongue-in-cheek point in terms of, posting about or criticizing or, whatever with some of these far right individuals or groups or movements or whatever. It's okay to laugh at them. Like, yes, these are incredibly serious times, but you got to have a sense of humor, and you got to laugh at some of these people sometimes. It's a good way to keep your sanity. It's a good way to help remember all of the dumb things that they do, because when you when when you poke fun at them, or you just kind of, to use the British term, you take the piss out of them a little bit, or more than a little bit, that's always been, I think, a good way to, it's not the only way, but I think it's a good way to, to tick off some of these kinds of far right folks, is just to point out silly shit they've done. Just to point out, oh, you shouldn't have posted that because now I know where this event was, or, oh, you shouldn't have posted it. There's sorts of examples like that. Just sometimes make fun of these people. You don't have to be rude and antisocial about it. It can even be childish and tongue-in-cheek. But you don't need to be serious all the time with these people, even though they're very serious people who pose serious harm. It's okay to, take them down a couple of pegs. Yeah. Humor. Don't forget, it's it works.
Yep. With the far right, oftentimes what they're trying to do, and the mistake I think many of us make when we try to push back on the far right is we try to engage them with ration and reason.
No.
And those are not things that the far right is
No.
concerned about. They are concerned about the appearance of strength and power, and mocking them is going to be far more effective to defeating them than providing a point-by-point rebuttal about why they're wrong.
Yeah, because they won't listen. It never works. Yeah.
Yeah. So to give an example, the UFC, right? There's a lot of chatter right now about Bryce Mitchell, a guy who has very openly supported Hitler and some of it, and talked about how, oh, well, maybe, I don't even want to get into it. But basically, if you look at just that, now we're steering the discussion about politics, and we're kind of taking Bryce Mitchell seriously, which really we shouldn't, because this is a guy who lost his testicle in a power drill accident. This guy is dumb as fuck, right? And so if we just talk about the fact that this guy is a neo-Nazi supporter or enthusiast or defender, then that makes him look more serious than he is, whereas in reality, he's just a dumb loser. And I think we always need to have that context so that these people don't come across as being bigger or more powerful than they are.
That's exactly it. I mean, with some of the articles that I've written that have, exposed or sometimes identified people or, really brought certain individuals to a bigger audience, there's always been an element of, well, on the one side, obviously pointing out the dangers that they pose because, there's a journalistic justification to write about them. But then also, even in a professional way, just poking fun at them, like with articles I've written about Rob Arundel, where he exposed, I didn't reveal the exact location in the article, but he exposed where he lived in Belgrade because of something that he posted and deleted 10 minutes later because I was able to find the graffiti, and he thinks the CIA, I used fancy CIA training to do it. It's like, no, I knew what neighborhood it was. I walked around until I found it, and that's where you kind of, these people who try to pump themselves up as wannabe Führers or wannabe whoever, and then sometimes you just got to be like, hey, you just posted your girlfriend's apartment on Telegram. Maybe that wasn't the best idea. You don't have to do anything with that, but you just got to point out, like, hey, dude, come on. Don't give them more power than they want. You can recognize the danger and very much the serious threat that these kinds of people pose without constantly being serious. You got to have a smile on your face when you're doing this sometimes, or else you'll go nuts. It's more fun that way.
Well, Michael, if people want to follow you, man, where can they check out your work?
Mostly on Blue Sky these days. I forget it's probably colborn.bsky.social. I think that's it.
I'll dig it up and put a link in the show notes.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, just look up my name on Blue Sky. You'll find it. I have a small public Instagram account. People can look for that as well. And also all our work is at bellingcat.com. Go there.
Amazing. Well, again, I'll link to that in the show notes to make it easy for people. But Michael, thank you so much for doing this, man. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it too. Thanks.
Most welcome. Thanks to the listeners as well. We'll talk to you in the next one. See you then.